Last week, Pope Leo had a Jubilee celebration for the youth. You may recall that before he passed away, Pope Francis had proclaimed 2025 to be a Jubilee year, kind of in keeping with the ancient tradition that we see in the Old Testament. The Israelites had a Jubilee year every 50 years, and the slaves were freed, debts were forgiven, people returned to their land. It was a year of celebration, a year of feasting, a year of rest. And so the church has carried on this tradition, but we celebrate the Jubilee year every 25 years. And so Pope Francis had declared 2025 to be the Jubilee year of hope. And he encouraged all of us to fan the flames of hope that have been given to us by God. And so last week, Pope Leo had this week-long Jubilee celebration for youth just outside of Rome. And it was an amazing turnout. They had over 1 million teens and young adults attend this celebration. About a year ago, a few of us went to the Eucharistic Congress in Indianapolis, and there were between 50 and 60,000 people there. And when we processed through Indianapolis, the procession went on and on and on. So I can't even hardly imagine 1 million youth. That's 20 times the number of people that were at the Eucharistic Congress, all coming to celebrate the faith. And during the event, at the final closing event, the Mass that Pope Leo had was celebrated with 450 bishops and 7,000 priests to serve the 1 million people in attendance. They heard almost 30,000 confessions over the course of that week. And one of the events that Pope Leo held, he had a prayer service that included praise and worship, gospel readings, Eucharistic adoration, but he also did a question and answer with the youth. And I thought a couple of the questions that the youth asked were really, really poignant. One young lady came up and asked Pope Leo, how can we find true friendship and genuine love in a world dominated by social media with its false friendships and its false narratives? It was an interesting question. I think it's something that we all can ask ourselves. Where do we find true love is truly what she was asking. Another one was a young man from America. His name was Will, and he asked Pope Leo, how can we truly encounter Jesus and be sure of his presence, even in the midst of the trials and tribulations in our lives? And again, I think that's something we can all relate to. In the most difficult moments of our lives, how can we have that assurance of God's love? How do we know that he's walking with us? If we look to our gospel readings, I think Jesus answers those questions for us. At the beginning of our gospel reading today, Jesus tells his disciples, be not afraid, because God our Father is pleased to give us the kingdom of heaven. God our Father wants what's best for us. He loves us completely. He wants us to spend all of eternity with him in heaven. And that's the promise that Jesus has on offer to us. And then in our gospel reading, he goes on to give us a little bit of practical advice on how to achieve that. And the first thing he tells us is store up treasure in heaven. Don't be focused on earthly things. And again, I think that kind of answers the question that the young girl asked Pope Leo. Where do we find authentic love? And Pope Leo in our gospel is telling us that we find that authentic love in the things of heaven, in how we live our lives, how we serve each other. True love isn't online. True love is out there, encountering our real people, being their friends, demonstrating God's love to them, and drawing them ever closer to God. The second advice that Jesus gives us in the gospel is to be prepared for the coming of the Son of Man. And that really kind of makes us think of the second coming of Christ, when Christ comes at the end of time. But it's also him coming at the end of our lives, that we're ready, that we live our lives in such a way that we can run to him and greet him at the end of our life. But it also speaks to the question that the second young man, Will, had, which is in the times of trial in our life, when our cross is heavy, how do we know Jesus is there? It's through faith. We know that he loves us. We know that he's demonstrated that love to us. In our second reading, it talks about the faith of Abraham. And faith isn't this nebulous thing that isn't scientific, isn't real. In our second reading, it says, the evidence of things unseen. And probably the best example of that is love. We see the evidence of love all around us. We may not be able to measure it scientifically, but we know it's there. And that is true for Christ as well. And the final thing, the final bit of advice that Jesus gives us is to be prudent with the gifts that God has given us. God has given us these abundant graces. And they're intended for us to give back, to use for the greater good and the greater glory of God, to help those in need, to be there for our families and friends and draw them ever closer to God. So Pope Leo answered Will's question saying this: if you truly want to encounter the risen Lord, listen to his word, which is the gospel of salvation. Reflect on your way of living and seek justice in order to build a more humane world. Serve the poor and so bear witness to the good that we would always like to receive from our neighbors. And then he went on to say, adore Christ in the Blessed Sacrament, our source of eternal life. Study, work, and love according to the example of Jesus, the good teacher who always walks beside us. If we think of the advice that Pope Leo is giving, that is what we do at every Mass. At every Mass, we come and we hear the good news. We hear the gospel message of Jesus. We reflect on how that resonates with our lives, how we live that out. And then we encounter Jesus truly present, body, blood, soul, and divinity in the Eucharist. We receive him. And then at the end of every Mass, we are told to go forth and glorify the Lord in how we live our lives, to take him out to our friends and family and our neighbor, and to make him present.